Colorful text over images of past events. Logo, Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network. Professional Development Workshops. Intro to Cultural Accessibility, a One State 2020 event. Split screen. At left, an ASL interpreter signs. At right, the speaker, Brittany Pyle.
Hi there, everyone. I want to welcome you to Intro to Cultural Accessibility. I'll be your MC for today. It seems like I work in a bunch of different places, but today I'm playing the role of project manager for Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network, ICAN, which you'll hear about a little more in a minute. I am just tuning in right now to let you know that you can access our service providers if you should need them. You should see our sign language interpreter spotlighted here beside me. If you'd like to see the closed captions, there is a closed captioning button at the bottom. Click that button and select Show Subtitles. And if you'd like to experience our audio description, which is a service for people who are blind or have low vision, just interested in seeing what it's like as well, just put your email in the chat box and we'll send you the link to the feed. It works best in Google Chrome. So for now, I'm going to kick this over to Encarnacion of the Illinois Arts Council Agency for some housekeeping notes, and I will be back in a few minutes.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Encarnacion Teruel, and I'm Deputy Director at the Illinois Arts Council Agency. I'm really excited to be part of today's presentation, and I'm looking forward to Betty and Tina's presentations. Before we get started, I wanted to just go over a couple quick housekeeping notes. Please feel free to use the chat box to chat with fellow participants and panelists. If you have a question you'd like the panelists to answer, please put that in the Q&A box instead of the chat. Chat is for general conversation and commentary. Q&A is for official questions. In the Q&A box, when someone asks a question, you'll see a thumbs up like symbol underneath the question. If you like a question and you think it is important, or a question that you also have, like it, and that will shoot the question up to the top and help us prioritize which questions to ask during the Q&A. A quick programming reminder. As a registrant of the One State Conference, you have access through tomorrow to Ines Summers' documentary film, Seasons of Change on Henry's Farm. The link to access that film is in your email. More importantly, tonight at 6:30, there's going to be a Q&A session with Ines Summers, Jean St. Alban from the executive director from the Jean Siskel Film Center, and myself. And we're looking forward to having an engaging conversation around Ines's film. The film is only 83 minutes long, so you have time after this session to see the film and then participate in the Q&A. I want to take this opportunity right now to ask for a moment of silence in remembrance and recognition of the 207,000+ Americans who have passed away from the pandemic, and to honor their families and friends who are in mourning. Thank you. I just wanted to tell you that ICAN, the Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network, is something that came about because of the 30th anniversary of the ADA Act being passed. That date was actually this last July 26th. The Arts Council has been committed to supporting and educating people around accessibility, especially our partners and our grantees. Not only are we committed to that, but it's actually the law that your programs and facilities be accessible. This panel today is going to demystify all of that for you. And I'm honored to say that the panel today, the presentation includes people that I've admired for a long time and that I consider to be friends, which is really fantastic. At the Illinois Arts Council, we wanted to do something to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the ADA Act passing. And so we wanted to do something that was significant, and we reached out to the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium to create an initiative partnership with them to create an Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network. And this network The reason we reached out to CCAC is because they are an international model for setting up these kinds of networks. Their impact has been felt across the country in many different cities and states, like Minnesota and Washington. So it was only natural that we reach out to them and let them take the lead in establishing an Illinois network. This Illinois network, and I think Christy may say a little bit more about it and also talk about CCAC, but this Illinois network is meant to be self-led by the participants. And everyone has an opportunity to be part of the network. There are no restrictions. There are no eligibility requirements. You just join and become part of our group. And if you become part of the Illinois network, you're going to realize that that community is one of the most welcoming communities that you'll ever find. So next, I'd like to introduce Christena Gunther, who's going to tell you a little bit about the CCAC and its history.
Thanks, Encarnacion. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to introduce CCAC. Just a bit about me first. I am by day the Director of Education at the Evanston Arts Center, and by night I am the founder and president of Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, CCAC. And CCAC was started in 2013 with a mission of empowering Chicago's cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. And we achieved this mission by providing professional development workshops like what we're experiencing today. We also provide, when it's not a pandemic, we provide equipment that we loan out for free to cultural organizations in the Chicago area to help them facilitate accessible programming. And we also have an access calendar that lists accessible offerings happening in the Chicago region. We're really excited to be partnering with the Illinois Arts Council to present ICAN, Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network. And we will definitely be reaching out to you again, but if you're interested in getting involved with ICAN, you can email us at ican@chicagoculturalaccess.org. That's ican@chicagoculturalaccess.org. Today is ICAN's first program, and we're so excited to have two amazing people, Betty Siegel from Washington, thanks to the pandemic, she can be here very easily, as well as Illinois' own Tina Childress. We will be having, as part of CCAC, some other really exciting events coming up. Just wanted to put on your radar, on October 29th, we'll be doing a program about welcoming individuals who have intellectual or developmental disabilities through your virtual programming. You can visit our website, chicagoculturalaccess.org, to find out more about that program, and as well as learn more about ICAN. The biggest thing I just wanted to say before I turn it over is that getting started with accessibility can be really overwhelming and it can be really daunting. And like Encarnacion mentioned, we have a community of people who are really dedicated to welcoming all visitors and all participants to our programs, and we will help you to make it easier for you. So you're not in this alone. Even if you're alone in your home, we can do this together and we can help make Chicago, Illinois, and the world more accessible. Thanks so much.
Return to Brittany Pyle.
Thanks, Christina. And in that vein of we're all in this together, I just wanted to chime in with some etiquette and what to expect. So just so you know, we should all collectively know we're all learning. So don't be afraid to ask a question if you don't know the right terminology. We all accept that we might be new at this. We might be at a different place in our journey on the access path. So don't be afraid to ask a question. We just ask that you ask it in a way that is respectful as you can. I wanted everyone to know we are recording this session. We want to make it available for later watches on CCAC's website, chicagoculturalaccess.org. And we will be circulating some resources in the chat box as well. So keep an eye on that if you have any questions or want some tips on how to get started. There'll be more linked there in the chat box. And also on our resource page that we're going to circulate, there is a link to a survey for ICAN, and we ask that if you haven't taken it already, we would love for you to take it just so you can explain to us where you are on your accessibility journey and how much you know about accessibility. What are your priorities to learn, so ICAN can offer the most relevant information to you as we plan more sessions like this. Okay, so having said all of that, I'd like to introduce Betty Siegel, who's Director of VSA and Accessibility for the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. She will give a lecture first, followed by Tina Childress of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, who's an educational audiologist. She will go second. The two of them will talk together, and then we'll end with about 15 minutes of Q&A. So I'll let Betty take it from here.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to get my screen ready to share with you guys.
Presentation slides on left 3/4 of screen. At top right is mini video of presenting speaker. First slide, title, Introduction to Cultural Accessibility.
Hi, thanks for that lovely introduction. It is a delight and honor to be here with you all today because I get to be on the stage today with some of my favorite people here in Chicago. My job today is set you up for an introduction to what is accessibility. And I like to do that by talking about who we do this for, why we do it, and then a little bit about how we do it. And then I'm going to let Tina dive into some of the hows in a very deep, deep way. So let's get going here.
Next slide.
So who
Title, Who.
do we want to make things accessible for? That's a big question because most of us carry around a lot of stereotypes inside of our head about who has a disability.
Next slide.
So first off, there's 61 million adults with disabilities in the United States. That's about 26% of the population, or 1 in 4 people. 1, 2, 3, and you. 1, 2, 3, and you. Of those 26% of adults in the United States with disabilities, you can see on the screen that about 5% are children between the ages of 0 and 15. Adults between the age of 15 and 59, which is a really broad spread, are 51% of the disability population. And then we have older adults who for age 16 above, who are 46% of the population of adults with disabilities in the United States.
Next slide.
Now, the really frightening thing about disability is that it has a disproportionate impact on different populations and groups. So we know from studies that women, people 65 and older, people in poverty, and certain racial and ethnic minority groups experience disability at a higher percentage than other populations in the United States. So 1 in 4 women have a disability, 3 in 10 non-Hispanic Blacks have a disability. And when you look at the CDC website, which I have a link to here on the screen, you can find more data that drills down even further. And you can even look at the percentages of disability in your specific state or population. The point here is that people with disabilities are not those people over there. People with disabilities are these people right here. Us, me, my family, my community, my colleagues, everyone around me. Statistically, I know I can count off and I'm going to run into a person with a disability. And I'd like you to think a little bit about who in your life experiences a disability. Disability is not always severe. Most people have mild disabling conditions. Only 2.9% of the population across the globe have very severe disabling conditions.
Next slide, title, Social Inclusion.
So why do we do this work? If we know that people with disabilities are this broad swath of the United States, and they are part of our community in a really real way, then why do we do this work?
At top right, mini video of speaker is replaced with ASL interpreter.
We do this work because we believe in social inclusion.
Next slide.
And we do this work because it is critical to keep in mind that disability rights are civil and human rights. And just because we have a COVID-19 roaming around out there, and just because we're in a pandemic, does not mean that we take those rights that have been fought for many years by the disability community and throw them out the window. It does not mean that federal law has changed and we no longer have to comply with these laws in order to be accessible. Civil rights and human rights and disability rights go together. We cannot have social justice without disability justice as well. So you do need to keep in mind as you go through your accessibility journey and you become a part of this wonderful, and I agree with Encarnacion, this embracing community, that there are federal laws that are out there, and I've listed just 3 of them here. The 1973 Rehabilitation Act you should be aware of Section 504, which says that if you receive any kind of federal financial assistance, you must comply. You may not discriminate against people with disabilities. For those of you that are around the Education Committee, you have the 1975 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a really critical law. It guarantees a child with a disability the right to a free and appropriate education. Courts have debated what appropriate means, but what it really means is a meaningful education. And although this law does not necessarily apply to cultural organizations like museums and theaters, because it only applies in that K-12 school environment, it has a significant impact on the way in which our societies have reached out and embraced people with disabilities and ensured that they get the same education the rest of us get, so that they can also become contributing members of our society. The final law, which most of you do know, is the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. Titles 1, 2, and 3, there are actually 5 titles, but focus on 1, 2, and 3, which cover employment, state and local government, and places of public accommodation, which may be where most of you all reside. There have been an amendment to the ADA in 2008, and then there was an update to the standards and regulations in 2010. So when you're out there Googling around, be sure to look at the date, because anything that was printed or published prior to 2010 may very well be out of date and may mislead you. You want to make sure you get information from 2010 forward so that you're sure you're getting information that is going to give you what the current regulations require. Now, also don't forget, wherever you are, whatever state you're in, that your state and local government may also have disability rights legislation and laws and regulations, as well as human rights that also frequently incorporate disability rights as a part of it. Later on, I'll be happy to talk about more of the law. If you have questions, put it in the chat or raise your hand, or just ask in the, I think you're supposed to ask in the Q&A, and I'm happy to dive into this stuff. I am a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer, so keep that in mind, but I'm still happy to talk about these things because I think this is a good foundation from which to start your accessibility journey.
Next slide.
Now, the other thing that's really important is that the disability community is asking us as a society to look at disability through a new lens. And this lens can sometimes be really frightening because we're so used to looking at disability through the lens of the medical or impairment model. And the disability community wants us to move to looking at disability through the lens of the social or civil rights model. Now, I'm just comparing these two on your screen. In the medical model, the way we approach disabilities, we say, oh my goodness, something is wrong with the person. In other words, the problem that we're trying to address, the challenge and the barriers that we're trying to overcome are inherent in that person. The problem is that the person has a disability. And so what we're constantly trying to do in this model of medical or impairment model is we seek to change the individual to accommodate society. And in this model, the individual is rarely empowered or enabled to make decisions or choices for themselves. Someone else in authority is always making that decision. The parent, the teacher, the doctor. Now, so we want to try to move the way that we think about disability and disability rights over here to the social and civil rights model, where we say instead of there's being something wrong with the person, because let's face it, people are not wrong. There's no such thing as a wrong person. We're all humans. We're all part of human society. And so we want to shift our whole perspective to say something is wrong with society. The problem is not with this individual with a disability. The problem is with us and everything out here. And thus we seek to change society to accommodate the individual. And the individual always has the right to participate in decisions that are made about them and by them and with them and for them. So this is a critical shift that I think if you grab onto this shift and you make this change, you're going to be an accessibility asset for your community.
Next slide.
Now, another way to look at that change is to look at the World Health Organization definition of disability. It's very different than the definition that you'll find in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in this definition, what we say is a person is more or less disabled based on their interactions with the physical environment, the communication environment, the information environment, and the social and policy environment. What does that mean exactly, you wonder? Well, I wondered too. So I thought about an example that's really good. My friend Beth and I, we frequently go to the theater together. And when we do, we go first to a little coffee shop and we get some coffee. And then we cross the street to go to the Kennedy Center. And when we cross the street to the Kennedy Center, the first thing that we see is a giant grand stairway. Now, my colleague and friend Beth is a wheelchair user. She uses a power chair. And she looks at me and I look at her. And we both look at the stairs and I say, bye-bye. And I run up the steps. And I go into the theater and she's stuck at the bottom of the steps. Which of us in that scenario is more disabled? And what's the disability? Well, she is, because she can't go up the steps. And the problem is not that she is a person with a disability or that she uses a wheelchair, it's that they're steps. So how do we, that's the physical environment. So let's do that scenario again. My friend Beth and I, we go to the theater. We first start at the coffee shop and we get a little cup of coffee, then we cross the street. And what's the first thing that we see? The grand stairway. And Beth looks at me and I look at her and she notices that off to the left, there's a sidewalk that bypasses the stairway. And she says a bye-bye to me this time. And she goes up that sidewalk and she's in the theater before I'm even halfway up the steps. In that scenario, which one of us is more disabled? And what made that disability? In that case, I'm the one who's more disabled because going up steps takes a lot of energy and I'm not in the best shape. But it's still, the problem is not my problem, it's the problem of the environment. So if we eliminate the steps or we put ramps in and we run things parallel to each other and we use universal design concepts, then the person is less disabled by their interaction with the environment. You can do the same thing with the communication environment. Luckily today we have captioning and a sign language interpreter. So what we've done is we've changed the communication environment. The information environment is the environment of the internet or the web, and social and policy environments are those things like the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. We changed the policy environment to incorporate federal laws that prohibit the discrimination against people with disabilities.
Next slide. Title, How.
Okay, so how do we do this work?
Next slide.
Are you guys still with me? Okay, that's good. All right, so first off, what I want to do is recommend that you plan for accessibility. Those people that have limited resources, limited time, limited money, you want to plan for accessibility. And this slide tells you, gives you an idea of what the plan for accessibility should include. But I want to just highlight a few really critical things that must be a part of any successful accessibility plan. And that is that, number one, you recognize the diversity of needs of people with disabilities in your community. You be responsive to the disability community. Secondly, you consider each and every unique situation and circumstances. What works at the Kennedy Center may not work for you, because your circumstances and your situation is unique. You want to weave accessibility, weave it into the operational, the organization's operational structure, because that's how access works. If you keep applying accessibility as a thought later, you will not be successful at making accessibility a part of your everyday work. And the way you get that to be a part of your everyday work is you set as a core value that accessibility is important and you resource for it, meaning you put aside the dollars, the time, and the staff to make access work.
Next slide.
So another thing you want to look at in order to have good accessibility taking place is you want to look at universal and human-centered design. There's two different ways of approaching it. There's the principles of universal design, which you see on the screen, probably to your left. that talk about equitable use and flexibility in use. There is a link at the bottom. Then there's the goals of universal design that look at the idea of body fit and comfort, personalization, cultural appropriateness. You really need to marry these two concepts together in order to really create environments that work. And this is exhibitions as well as performances.
Next slide.
We want you to look at core accommodations. There should be a foundation of accessibility that you put into place that never wavers. And then everything else is built on top or around that. Like I had said before, you really want to make sure that accessibility is operationally integrated.
Next slide.
You also want to look at technology. Look what we have today. COVID has made us all technology smart. Well, maybe not smart. I do have trouble still with technology, but I'm technology aware. And I am aware of the fact that accessibility is not a feature, it is a social trend. And that technology, when done well, is inclusive, and when done poorly, is exclusive. So be sure to look at technology and how it both supports and includes people and can also exclude people.
Next slide.
We also want to look at customized and personalized experiences. You want to empower people to choose the experience that is right for them. And so, for example, at the Kennedy Center, we offered sensory-friendly performances for the first time along about 10 years ago, I think. And I had a parent come up to me after the show and she said, "This was terrible." And I was like, "Oh no, it was terrible? What do you mean?" I mean, we had the house lights to half. We let the kids move around and we didn't shush people. We let them talk. And the parents said, "Yeah, that was terrible. My child couldn't concentrate. There was all this stuff going on." And I said, "Well, that's wonderful. Because now we know, you and I both, that this sensory-friendly environment is not the right environment for you. And I have other experiences that are the right environment. So you want to provide entry points for different people at different places and give them the choice to enter into the experience at the space that's comfortable for them.
Next slide. Contact info for Betty Siegel.
So that is the end of my presentation. Again, we're going to have lots of time to chat, but I want to turn this over to my colleague, Tina.
Thank you, Betty. I'm going to get ready here and share my screen.
Briefly return to split screen. The next slide presentation opens on left 3/4 of screen. At top right is mini video of ASL interpreter signing. Title, Front End and Back End Best Practices for Serving Patrons Who Are Deaf and Hard of Hearing.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tina Childress, and I am so thrilled to be a part of this inaugural webinar here with Betty Siegel, someone that I admire very much, and I appreciate all the works that she's done. So my part in this is to give a perspective as a deaf and hard of hearing consumer. When ICAN set out the surveys in the beginning, this was a topic that was requested, and so that's why I'm here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the back end and the front end planning to making sure that you can accommodate your patrons that are deaf or hard of hearing.
Next slide.
So a little bit about me. I am a mom to 2 girls. I have, sorry, we just lost the interpreter. I have a 19-year-old and a 13-year-old. My 19-year-old is actually majoring in theater right now, and my 13-year-old is also very interested in theater. So I feel pretty proud that, you know, that they have been influenced kind of by my life and the things that we love, and that we can enjoy these things together. I'm also a wife of over 25 years, 26 years. I'm also an audiologist. So that is significant because I am also, ironically, a late deafened adult. I have bilateral cochlear implants to help me hear. I am also fluent in ASL. So it's kind of a weird combination. I actually had normal hearing first, and then I lost my hearing later. And now I have these amazing devices to help me hear. So Betty's quote about technology really hits home to me. So I've been in love with musical theater for a long time. I started playing instruments as a young child. So on the left on the screen is a playbill from Peter Pan. I remember seeing that at the Airy Crown Theater in Chicago back in the 70s when it was Sandy Duncan. Yeah, that's how old I am. I think I just dated myself. And so that was like the beginning of being able to see a show every year with my family. That was always my birthday present. And so I've had this love since I've been young. Growing up, I continued to do and be involved in theater, usually in the pit. I did some stage stuff also when I was in high school. And I came to college to be an engineer, go figure. And I love technology. And I love technology, and engineering is interesting, but I didn't have a passion. So turns out I took a class that had nothing to do with engineering, and that was a sign language class. And that sign language class introduced me to audiology, which changed the trajectory of my life. And I didn't know that I would experience hearing loss myself, so it was definitely serendipity that it all happened. And so I feel like there's a reason that I do what I do. I love to innovate and come up with solutions. So sometimes I say, like, I have an engineer brain, but I have an audiologist heart. I love to collaborate with people and share information and learn information from everybody. As a late deaf and adult and someone that kind of is in the professional audiology world and also the consumer deaf and hard of hearing world, I've also mentored many people, and I've been an advocate. And, you know, I've been involved with some people that are actually on this webinar here today in terms of advocating for access in theater settings. So I'm very proud of those works. So when you look down at the bottom also, the reason that I put those specific labels on there, Rent was the last musical I remember hearing before I lost all my hearing. It's also significant because when the 20th anniversary came around, there was an issue that I had with getting access at a theater. And as a result of that, you know, we tried to mediate and tried to figure it out, and it kind of escalated to the point where it did become a lawsuit. And luckily, we persevered and we triumphed. And what it was about them trying to tell me what I needed. So when you guys think about planning, I know that there are some things that you don't know that you don't know. And so listen to your patrons, listen to their requests, because what they were trying to give me was not what I was asking for, and it was not appropriate. And so that's why things happen that way. I put Wicked on there because I've seen that show 20 times. One of them, Betty, was at the Kennedy Center, and it was the first time I had seen an open caption performance. It was during HLAA, the Hearing Loss Association of America conference. There were 600 deaf or hard of hearing people that got to experience Wicked with open captioning at the Kennedy Center. It was amazing. And then, of course, you know, Hamilton. This is before they became really famous. I was actually in New York City for a different thing. It was for another show, and I was like, oh, I'm bored. And I ended up over by the theater, and then the doors opened up, and all of a sudden, there's the cast of Hamilton. So, you know, it's all about the selfies. The last picture is a picture of two interpreters, me and my daughter. And we are at a conference called Broadway Con. It's like Comic Con for geeks. And at that conference, we go for my daughter to learn about theater, but there was always also an accessibility panel, which was always very interesting to me to figure out what was going on and to kind of get like the pulse.
Next slide.
So I've been to many shows over the years. I think I've counted like 70 or 80. Since I became deaf, so that was in August of 2000, well, when I got my first implant, almost all of the shows that I've ever seen have had some kind of accessibility, either captioning or a sign language interpreter, or there have been even times where, you know, I've had a script and then I read the PDF of the script. And so my point is we can make accessible theater happen. And it can happen from Broadway shows to local productions to do-it-yourself captions. It is very possible.
Next slide.
So Betty kind of touched on this already, on these statistics, about 61 million people having disability. Again, I am going to focus on the patrons that are deaf or hard of hearing because it's growing. The number of patrons that are getting older are growing, and that means we need to figure out how to accommodate them.
Next slide.
So this was actually another graphic. The numbers kind of don't match, but let's focus.
At the top of the screen, a volume level bar appears.
Oh, technology is fun. Okay, so my point is that the average age of a Broadway attendee is in like that 40 to 49 age range. For about the past 2 decades, it's averaged between like 40, 45. For the touring shows, the average is about 53. Okay, and you can see as people get older, we're going to see more people that have hearing loss. Now, hearing loss is one of those insidious things that you don't always know that it's happening. It can happen very slowly. Sometimes people don't want to treat it or don't want to acknowledge it, or they don't know about the different technologies that are out there. So if we consider the fact that many of the people that are enjoying theater might be getting older, they could also be second language learners. People can benefit from things like captioning in those situations as well. So, you know, as Betty was talking about universal design from the perspective of, you know, like that person isn't broken, it's how can we make it more accessible and keep building those ramps for everyone.
Next slide. Title, Customer Service and Building Relationships.
So let's talk a little bit about customer service. So as a theater goer, what's important for me is that I know that there's a place I can go if I'm going to have a problem. I mean, I'm pretty tech savvy. I know how to use a website, but there are times when the link isn't working or I'm not sure where seating is. So think about, for your theater, having one person or maybe a team of people that are going to be responsible for access. And do surveys, you know, get feedback from the patrons. That is always going to be really helpful. If you are going to have an ASL, interpreted performance, consider using people that are deaf or hard of hearing to either advertise or to maybe help usher in people that are coming. In the box office, make sure that you have very clear signage about what kinds of accommodations that you have. There are times when I will go to a theater and I know that they have certain accommodations already set up, but I always scan and I try to think, what if it wasn't me with that person that knows this knowledge? How about if it was just somebody off the street coming to the theater for the first time? You know, not knowing that, oh, that Broadway play, now I can get captions on my phone or with the device that they supply, or knowing that, you know, there's going to be open captions for this performance, or that there's an assistive listening device that I can use. So make sure that your signage is clear. The other thing you need to do is make sure your box office staff is trained. There have been times when I've been the consumer going up to the box office staff and having to train them about the equipment. So make sure that they know about all of that.
Next slide.
All right. In terms of scheduling, again, listening to the consumer is really important. You know, the typical choices are an assistive listening device, which makes things, it brings microphones closer to the person's ears. So an actor or a performer will talk into their microphone, and that signal will go straight to my, you know, cochlear implants or hearing aids or what have you, either with headphones or some other kind of device. And that works for some people. Some people want captioning. Some people want an ASL interpreter. So I went on a cruise right before COVID hit, and I requested accommodations, and the cruise company kept trying to give me ASL interpreters and also assistive listening devices, but that's not what I asked for. I asked for captioning. Why? Even though I'm fluent in ASL, I was going with my deaf friend who doesn't know any sign language. And so we kept reiterating to them that those two accommodations were not appropriate. The assistive listening devices wouldn't work for her because she's pretty deaf. And even if you have a microphone and it goes straight to her ears, it's not going to help. She doesn't know sign language, so the ASL interpreters weren't going to help. Our solution was what? Captioning. So listen to the consumer. Something that's helpful is as you start scheduling for accessible performances, as a consumer, I don't expect you to have an interpreter and a captioner for every performance that you have. But what would be nice is if you could schedule performances regularly within a run, like the second Saturday of the show run. And then if there's a group, sometimes you'll have a group where they all want ASL interpreters, or there's another group where they want captioners. And so maybe you only have to do one, but you may also have to do both, depending on how the mix-up of your audience is. Be open to outside requests. Outside requests means outside of your scheduled performance. So I try to always go to a scheduled, accessible performance if it fits in with my schedule. When it doesn't, I'm very respectful and give them plenty of notice to ask them, hey, can we try this other Saturday? And almost always they're accommodating that way. Do surveys to also determine accommodations. You may find out that most, like 99% of the people that come to your shows want ASL interpreters, or 99% of them want captioning, and you can start to see trends that way.
Next slide.
In terms of outreach, make sure that your pre and your post-show events are accessible too. So if there's any kind of question and answer with the actors or any kind of dialogue that way, that you can provide access. You may want to also present to your local hearing loss advocacy group. There are a few that are listed here in the PowerPoint. Don't forget to reach out to students. I think sometimes with theater, unless you are very focused on working on children's theater, we tend to focus on adults, but these kids are going to be our future theater patrons. And if we get them hooked early, they can grow in their love for theater, and we can show them what's possible. There are hearing loss events that sometimes happen locally, and if you had a booth or flyers that you can put in their conference bag to advertise about your services, that's always good. Think about an outreach committee. Are there people that are there that's kind of a brain trust, can think about a variety of disabilities and ways that you can reach out. Don't forget to be an ally. If there are organizations looking for board members and you notice and you look around and they all kind of look the same, think about BIPOC people. Think about people with disabilities. Think about those underrepresented groups that are not part of the conversation at that table when they should be.
Next slide.
Some website tips. You want to make sure that the accessibility information is easy to find. You want to make sure that the tickets are easy to order. It would be great if you didn't have to call a phone number to get accessible tickets. As a deaf or hard of hearing person, we do have other, ways that we can communicate on the telephone, but that's just another step. So for us, email or even a designated text number can go a long way. Think about maybe having dates for all accessible shows on one page. If you give discounts to people that have a disability, you may want to put that information on there. I know like in Chicago, we have a very active listserv, and they will usually send out blast emails that have a specific code for ordering discounted tickets. So that's one way that you can approach that also. Don't forget to have a policy about companions and service animals. You know, theater is a community event. You know, Betty goes with her friend that's in a wheelchair. I may want to go with my child. I don't want to have my preferential seating because I'm deaf. And then my kid, you know, when they were young, like 11 or, you know, or younger, when we were going to theater, I don't want them sitting, you know, 10 rows behind me. Think about companion seats. Also think about things like service animals. Let's see what else. Any kind of media that you put out there, you want to make sure it's accessible. At the very least, have captioning. Best practices would also include an ASL interpreter. So I know that Christina in the beginning started, she was talking about the access calendar, and that's a great example of, you know, ways that people collaborate and people contribute their different events. And I can just look at all of, you know, before, I could look at all of October and see what was happening.
Next slide.
So outdoor spaces, we know that that's also a challenge. So, you know, I'm done with theater for now. I'm thinking about like national parks and zoos and museums and things like that also. We need to make sure that any kind of auditory information in those spaces are also accessible. I know that this has gotten so much better over the past few years. The first time that I went to LEAD, LEAD, that's what the Kennedy does, and that's run by Betty. I was blown away at all of the different accommodations that are available for a variety of things. So we're not just talking about theater. You know, you want to think about also, you know, children's museums and art institutes and things like that.
Next slide.
So real quickly, some of the possible solutions that are out there for people that are deaf or hard of hearing. So for people that are visual, that either need they can have either captioning or they can have sign language interpreters. Okay. When we're talking about captioning, so right now, obviously, while we're doing everything virtually, we're not all in a physical space. Now that we have the infrastructure with things like Zoom and people have everything set up on the internet, we can do things remote and virtually. What we have also in terms of captioning is called closed captioning, because you can turn it on and you can turn it off. You know, sometimes you're going to go to a space and the captioning is on the screen and you can't do anything, it's just there. That's called open captioning. So think about the different technologies that you want to use that way. Something that a lot of people are thinking about now also is, do I hire a captioner? This is what we have here, which is best practice. Or do we want to use maybe something like a speech to text app, like Google or something like that? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. With sign language interpreters, of course, also, they can be on site or remote, like we have today. And then for auditory support, there are assistive listening devices. So here's the thing for me with assistive listening devices. If everybody in your cast has a mic, or everyone on your panel or your play or what have you has a mic, assistive listening devices are great. If only a few people have a mic, then the people that are deaf or hard of hearing are going to miss all of those people that don't have a mic. So think about that as you plan.
Next slide. Title, unscripted content.
All right. So when you look at whether or not you want to hire someone for captioning, or you want to maybe use automatic speech recognition, you need to think about a few of these things. So best practice would be to use a live captioner. They can use their ears, their eyes, their brain to catch any of the information that's missed. Sometimes they can even ask for people to repeat what they said. They can go back and make corrections. Now, because of all of that process happening, there is a slight delay. So you'll notice the captioning that's on here right now, because the captioner has to think about all of these things and get it through her software and what have you, there is a slight delay, but it's going to be accurate. If you are thinking about using Zoom, know that you can use live captioners in breakout rooms. There is a cost involved. Okay, you need to pay the captioner. So alternatively, there is automatic speech recognition. I have mixed feelings about automatic speech recognition. It is very susceptible to noise, multiple people talking, if there's a bad audio connection, if someone is very soft-spoken. If all of those things are happening, you're not going to get very good accuracy at all. But when it works, the delay is very minimal. So for someone like me that can hear pretty well, something like ASR will help because I can just look down to see what I just missed. It cannot be used in Zoom breakout rooms if that's something you're considering. And it can be free, or there could also be a cost depending on the service that you pick. So I'm happy to talk with any of you guys afterwards about this a little bit more in depth. But this is something that as people are thinking about access, they're like, well, if I can just use a speech to text app that's free, that's good enough. Well, how would you like to watch something that is only 80% accurate? Okay.
Next slide.
Other caption options is that if you're having a show, there are actually captioners that their job is to do theater captioning. And so there are professionals out there that you can find. You can do it yourself captions. So for some of the smaller theaters, this is something that is pretty popular if it's something that's scripted. You know, the lines are going to be the same. And so you can do PowerPoint slides or what have you and just have a staff person advance the slide for the next line. So that's something that you can do. So a good friend in Chicago has a company called Caption Point. And on his website, he has awesome best practices for creating your own captions. You can provide a PDF of the script. So when my daughter was in a show and it was kind of a last minute thing, or maybe I didn't know if I could go, I just asked for a PDF of the script. And so this is me looking at it on my iPad with it flipped where the background was black, the text was white so that I wasn't too bright in the theater, and then I could follow along. You know, that's not ideal, but it was a solution for that moment. So the other thing I want to make you think about also is sometimes when it comes to things like handheld devices for captioning, like use your phone or use your iPad or use our device, how is the patron going to hold that for 2.5 hours? Okay, or is it going to come on a mount? I'm going to show you some other pictures like Kennedy Center. Again, Betty Siegel, hats off to you and your crew. You guys did a phenomenal job the 2 times that I've seen shows there.
Next slide.
Okay. So here are some examples of captioning. This one is on site, and you can see that there's actually someone that is what we call walking cart. And so she's captioning and it goes wirelessly to a device that I'm holding in a theater. You can also have remote captioning where someone, you know, like what we're doing right now where they're not even on site.
Next slide.
I just have like 1 or 2 more slides and then I'm all done. The last one, this one is some captioning at Second City. You can see that they put up like monitors for us to see things. And then here are some examples of some apps that you can get on your phone. When I went to Mount Rushmore, this is an example of open captioning. You can't turn stuff off. So you can see there are lots of different ways that you can do it.
Next slide.
And with that, I will be done. And I think now it's just time to chat with Betty.
Split screen. Clockwise from top left is Tina, ASL interpreter, Betty, and Brittany.
I just wanted to kick it off for a question for you both to talk about, and take it however you will. But how has the pandemic impacted your jobs or your personal experience and impacted accessibility? Take it from there.
You want to go first, buddy?
Sure, I'll go very briefly. It is really obvious that the pandemic has had a significant impact on our field. The cultural industry is deeply challenged by these circumstances. I know that many colleagues, many dear friends are being furloughed or being laid off. And unfortunately, I do see a trend that I wish I could reverse. Maybe Illinois can be the state that does it right. And what I see is that because a museum or theater isn't having as people coming into the venue for experiences there, or fewer people coming into the venue for experiences there, they are letting go of their accessibility experts. So they're in-house 504 ADA coordinators, which, by the way, even if you let go of your 504 ADA coordinator, not as your lawyer, but as someone who knows a lot about the law, I strongly recommend that A, you don't do that because you're letting expertise walk out the door, and B, you immediately nominate somebody else to be your ADA 504 coordinator because federal regulation requires you to have a person with that title on staff. And the worst thing to happen is to get a lawsuit over something silly like I forgot to give that designation to somebody. So do that immediately. So that's what I'm seeing is happening with COVID, is that it really is hard on our industry. It's going to take us a while to recover, but I really, really, really don't want to see accessibility being put on a back burner or let us slide down that slippery slope. We fought so hard to climb up that slope. And to backslide on accessibility, to me, would be a horrendous disservice to humanity. Tina, what has your experience been?
So along those same lines, I know that it's kind of like education. What I'm seeing is that as we are kind of pivoting to doing more virtual performances, I find that a lot of places don't know what they don't know. They don't know about captioning. They don't know how to Zoom or StreamYard or to do all of these things. And so what I've been busy doing this summer, and like what we've all been collaborating about and educating people about, are ways that we can accommodate people online, which to me is very inspiring that they are thinking about that, which is good. But you know, kind of what you're saying too, I know that for some people, you know, they just want to be able to put on a performance, and all too often accessibility is kind of an afterthought as opposed to being planned in the budget ahead of time. And so for me, what I've been seeing in theater are people that are thinking outside of the box and thinking of ways that they can still perform and work and entertain. And I just, you know, I hope that we can help create maybe different opportunities for the people that have been furloughed, you know, like that we can collaborate with, you know, people that are looking for a job. But I think with this transition, you know, the technology part of that can be a little bit daunting.
Let me add a positive spin to some of this, because I realize I just went really hard on you guys, which I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But, you know, the other, like Tina said, what we're doing right now is we're having a huge cultural revolution. And types of technology that are being brought online really quickly and really fast are actually pretty darned amazing. And I find that my colleagues in the museum world and in the theater world, because we're creative people, are finding ways to use technology to make culture available. And then what I'm finding is that they are using the features that some of this technology brings with it, like the ability to see a sign language interpreter, to have the cart happening real and live and on screen, taking place. I'm finding in some ways we're more accessible than we were. There are two other things I want to bring up when we talk about what's happening in our industry as we confront these very challenging circumstances, is that we're finding that in some ways we're making everything sensory friendly right now, right? So the things that appeal to some people with some kinds of autism, like having more space, not being all crowded in. What are we doing with social distancing? We're giving people more space. We're not crowding in. When we set up seats for people in an environment, we're putting the seats further apart from one another. That can be very welcoming to some populations. The technology itself can be welcoming. People with anxiety disorder, people who are less comfortable with the social milieu, are finding that Zoom really works for them. I think about the fact that we're recording this session, and if you missed something because you didn't hear it, or your processing wasn't going as fast as my mouth was going, you can go back in and you can listen to it or watch it again and catch yourself up and experience the experience at a speed that works for you. So I think there's, as with everything, blessings and curses. And in some ways, I hope we walk out of the pandemic with a level of sophistication around accessibility that we didn't have before. And I do think that's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think too, like having a choice, you know, I think after all this is said and done and we are able to go in the theaters again, I know that there are some people that are thinking of kind of staying in the virtual world. And so, for example, you know, having this audio description happening for this conference and it being more available maybe on virtual platforms. My friends that are blind or low vision, they were telling me that what they liked working from home because they can set up their home environment exactly the way that they want it. You know, they can have the biggest monitor that they have, get really close to it. It doesn't matter if they're that close and, you know, maybe before they were conscious about what they look like, trying to do their job on a monitor like that. You know, people that are blind or vision don't have to, you know, navigate through the city to get to the theater, or if you have a physical disability. And so some, you know, some people really do like that. So that's another positive thing that I've seen happen.
We are hearing from the disability community things like, wow, for years I have asked my employer to let me work remotely from home and was told no, it wasn't possible. And yet today we know that it is possible. And so it's really opening some doors that were definitely closed and locked. And now we're going to break down those barriers as well.
I'm wondering if both of you could talk about preferred platforms for virtual events or just meetings and keeping accessibility at the forefront of those choices.
I'll go first, Betty.
Yes, please.
So for me and my experiences and what I've been seeing around the country, Zoom is the preferred platform right now. I know that there are concerns or have been concerns about privacy. There are still some entities, including schools, that still refuse to use Zoom because of their, you know, initial snafu that happened when COVID started and the security breaches were happening and things like that. But in my experiences, you know, managing some webinars and meetings and stuff like that, they are thinking about accessibility. There are features like being able to pin more than one video on your screen. So pinning, if you remember, affects only you. Whereas as a host or like a webinar host, if we spotlight someone, then that affects everyone's view. Well, now you can spotlight more than one person and you guys can pin more than one person. So, you know, there's captioning options that are happening and features that are just more accessible. And I see that happening faster on Zoom. This integration also with live streaming and webcasting is something that's new to, you know, everyone with the pandemic. What I've seen also is that it wasn't always accessible, especially in the beginning. But I think it's getting better. I think people are starting to learn about things. We have people developing products that can integrate the accessibility more seamlessly. So that's a positive thing. You know, for me, it's like job security because it's constantly changing. And so, again, don't be afraid to ask questions and to reach out to your peers. That's what ICAN is all about. Being able to use like a collective knowledge, because there's, no way that we can all know everything, but you will know people that know a lot about a little bit of something.
Yeah, I can't say that I have a favorite platform, nor can I endorse any of them. But what I do see is there has definitely been a trend for the better. As we use these different platforms, we are finding that the developers of the platforms are being fairly receptive to integrating features that make this environment, remember, we're trying to fix environments, not people, make this information environment much more accessible. I think that Zoom just rolled something out recently, as Tina mentioned, where it allows us to pin or spotlight multiple people, which then allows you to see the speaker and the sign language interpreter. So that's a really positive sign. Usually in the past, it's taken years for us to convince the technologists to increase the levels of accessibility, and suddenly, because it affects everyone in our society and it's not about those people over there, suddenly people are very aware of the fact that this is about us. And we have to fix this environment so that we have access in a real and meaningful way. So I do think that we're seeing some really positive signs from all these different platforms. But I'm not going to name one over the other because that's not my area of expertise. I do want to remind people, though, not to forget about websites. A lot of people are going to your website because your phones are down to find information about what's happening. When are you going to reopen? How have things changed? Access does not work if your website is not accessible. So think really hard about that as well, because up until the pandemic, website accessibility was the area in which lawsuits were growing the most. And the lawyers that I know are pretty sure that once we get past COVID and the pandemic, or we're into our new normal, that those websites will become the focus of accessibility again. So pay attention to that. If you're working with designers, be sure they know what they're talking about. You must work with knowledgeable people, and you must make accessibility a requirement of your agreement with your developers and designers. Don't let them off the hook. You say in the contract that you sign with them that you, as the owner of that website, have every expectation that they will comply with WCAG, WCAG 2.1 voluntary standards. Put it in the agreement, hold them to it.
There was actually a question that came through about that. And how would either of you recommend going about finding a web developer that is knowledgeable about web accessibility standards and prioritizes that? Is that something that you just put out a call and you make it a requirement as one of your must-haves on your website? Or is there a resource that you would recommend of connecting to web developers that are hip to this?
WC3 does have listings of people and resources, but your best resource is your community of people with disabilities and your local artists community. So absolutely, ICAN, CCAC, these are the folks that live in your world and know the good people in your community. And I bet they can give you a lot of really excellent guidance on who to talk to. Also, talk to people who are blind, or the blind low vision associations always involve people with disabilities when you're making decisions like this. So you've got things like the National Federation for the Blind, which has local chapters, the American Council for the Blind, which has local chapters. Those organizations are going to have a pretty good idea of what works, of who works and who doesn't work on accessibility.
So the other thing I was thinking about too, like as we start figuring out who are like the good developers for stuff like that, encourage them to maybe mentor like these new developers that are wanting to learn about that, because if we can grow that community of developers that are knowledgeable about accessibility, that's less work that we have to do, because they will already know what to do. And before I forget, also a way that you can drive people to your website. I was talking with a friend, she was actually on a panel for musicians and that do live performance. And one of the things that's hard when you're deaf or hard of hearing is lyrics, right? What if at your stage you have like a big QR code that people can snap a picture of that sends you to the website. So like things like having lyrics on a website, if you are a musician, is a really good thing if you're okay with putting your lyrics on there. But that can help drive traffic because you want to say, oh, we're going to do this song next. This is on our website. It's going to keep driving people to your website. So that can be a good thing too.
Another question regarding technology and tablet use. This question is for Tina. If there aren't enough seats in the section that's viewable of ASL or captions, would you mind having a tablet that is filming the ASL interpreter and you're sitting in a different location in the theater? How do you feel about proximity to interpreter?
So for an ASL interpreter, I have yet to see any theater employed watching an interpreter on a screen, and a lot of that just has to do with bandwidth. I mean, the chances of it getting laggy and then the signing to be all jagged, and they would have to be kind of big. So I would say in terms of sign language interpreters, I would not recommend that. And I have been to different venues where we've had captioning, and there are some theaters where I'm sitting towards the front, and there were other times when I was further away. It all depends on line of sight. So what I would recommend is having a section kind of reserved, and then maybe a week before the performance, releasing them to the general public. If people with disabilities have not already taken up those seats, that's what they do with the Chicago, the Broadway series, Broadway in Chicago. It's fantastic. And so when I go see a Broadway show there, the first 20 rows stage right are automatically reserved. And I know that's where my seating is going to be. If I make last minute reservations, then I just understand that the chances are I may not have a seat there, and that's on me. So best case scenario, especially for interpreters, is just go ahead and reserve some seats so that that they will be available.
I want to jump in on that also. I think it's great when we take advantage of technology and experiment and innovate. But when you're talking about sign language interpreters or even captioning and the theater, okay, so this is different in a museum, because in a museum, your audience has a lot of leeway and freedom to move around the space and to move closer or further away from the objects that they're looking at most of the time. But in a theater, you're kind of stuck. Your seat is where your seat is. And you have to keep in mind, as you experiment with all this fun gadgetry, that people's brains cannot see near and far at the same time, okay? And so when you put a sign language interpreter in an iPad or some other small device that I have to hold or that's in my immediate vicinity, yet the stage, the thing I came to see, I didn't come to see the captioning, I came to see the play. The play is way over there. And so what you're doing is you're making it so that my brain and my eyes have to constantly be flipping back and forth, near, far, near, far, near, far, near, far. So I'm looking down, I'm looking up, I'm looking down, I'm looking up, I'm looking near, I'm looking far, I'm looking near, I'm looking far. And the way to kind of do this so you get a really good idea of what that experience is like is you hold your finger up in front of your face and you look at your finger, and you'll see that your fingers, you can focus on your finger, but then be aware of the background, and the background is fuzzy. Now look past your finger at something in the distance. What happens? The thing in the distance snaps into shape. It's nice and clear, but now your finger is fuzzy. That's what's happening when you give someone something to look at right here, when what they want to be looking at is something over there. So a lot of these fun technologies that have kind of come and gone, like eyeglasses with captioning across them, the challenge there was that they were trying to trick your brain into thinking that the captioning that was actually physically right here on your glasses was actually taking place out there. And that's been a challenge that's I don't think anyone's really mastered yet.
Well, in Chicago, I have to say there's quite a few theaters that they actually put captions on stage. And so it's almost like when you go to a movie theater and you're watching like a movie in a foreign language and you have the English subtitles, there's no having to focus near and far. And if you couple the fact that older people are the ones experiencing hearing loss, and like older people notice this stuff.
She pointed her gray
also
hair.
start having eye problems, like my bifocals, it makes it awful trying to see things near and far. So that can make it hard too.
But I do have to admit, the question about sign language interpreters is really intriguing to me right now, because before we didn't have Zoom, and I'm kind of thinking here, what happens? Because we see this interpreter, it seems to be working. I think there's some opportunities out there for some people to do a little bit of experimenting with technology that we didn't have before.
I agree.
I have two questions that I think are talking about budget. So the first question is talking about, what if there isn't a run? If you have just a bunch of unique performances, there's nothing that occurs twice. What are the resources for funding to be able to do on-demand accessibility requests for service providers and equipment if everything is unique? Which I'll put to you guys, but I have some insight on with my role at Chicago Humanities Festival, since all of our events are unique. So that's part one, that's question one, but also a lot was said about building a budget and a team that accounts for accessibility measures. This is easier for large institutions like art museums and theaters. Do you have any advice to increase the accessibility in small art spaces that might not have the same resources or bandwidth? There was a mention of relying on your connections and community, but is there a way to do this that also properly compensates them?
All of those are great questions, Brittany. You're going to have to remind me what they were in order. So the one I remember is the one you asked most recently.
Yeah. Let's start with the one that, what if all of your offerings are unique and there isn't a run? So how do you handle accessibility requests coming in for a lot of things that are just unique?
I'm going to go back to the fact that you've got to plan for it. Okay, so first of all, you have to identify those features of accessibility that can be incorporated and integrated in such a way that they are always there. Okay, so for example, you can go and buy an assistive listening system, install it, and it is always there. So it's not a matter of requesting it or not, it is just there 100% of the time. I use that as an example because it's actually a requirement of federal law. You must have assistive listening devices always there and always turned on, and the battery is always charged. Another issue. But then there are other features of accessibility that usually require a human being to deliver them, such as a sign language interpreter, an audio describer, a captioner. These things are harder to integrate into every single performance and every single event and every single public program at a museum. And in that case, I would recommend that you do, first of all, two things. One, go back to your community, start a community advisory group right away, and ask them how to address the question you just asked us. And ask them to help you prioritize the levels of accessibility and what kind of access services you're going to provide. Ask them to help you make those choices because they're more aware of who is in your community and what your community is going to need and or want. And then secondly, plan for it. If they said, look, you know, we have a really large signing deaf community like here in DC with Gallaudet University, then I might prioritize sign language interpreters over captioning. But if I've got a really large older or aging population, I may prioritize captioning over sign language interpreting. I never say no, never say no. The people who lose in lawsuits are the people who say no. So if you get a request and they're asking for something that you don't typically provide or you haven't provided in the past, don't say, no, we don't do that. Instead say, well, let me look into that. Let me ask my advisory committee about that. So the thing with being a smaller organization is that you have to marshal your resources. The law doesn't require you to put yourself out of business. It requires you to provide effective communication for someone. It requires you to provide accessibility for someone. So some of these human based services, sign language, captioning, audio description typically, you don't have to just be throwing money out the window and providing those all the time until you have a person who needs and or wants that. And then you kick in the resources. What do you think, Tina? And then Brittany, you're up.
I think as a consumer, I am very aware that I always need to plan. As someone with a disability, we have to plan for things an hour, 2 hours, you know, arriving there early, make sure all the equipment works, you know, for people that have physical disabilities, trying to maneuver, you know, where they're going to put their chair or what have you. And so I'm kind of used to that. And I also try to be reasonable. You know, I don't want to be, you know, militant, you know, angry deaf woman saying that you need to give me this, this, and this. I'm going to give you guys 4 to 6 weeks to figure it out. But I think as planners on the front end, you need to also let your potential patrons know that there are options available, but you need to let us know. So for like those one-day runs that you were talking about, if you say, I mean, for me, it would be reasonable to say, you know, we would like to have any accessibility requests 2 weeks in advance. I think that's fair. Or if your community advisor group says, we're just going to provide accessibility and we're going to prioritize captioning, that's another way that you can approach it too. I think it really depends on the community that you're in. But I think it starts with you letting people know that you're open and able to give accessibility options to them and to give them a voice.
Planning is really key to this, really. It's running the scenarios, running the what ifs. What if somebody asks for this? What if somebody needs this? What if? And then doing your homework so that you've called the sign language interpreting agency in advance to say, how much notice do you need if I require a sign language interpreter for an event, a performance, an exhibit that I'm running? And if they say we can do it in 2 days, then 2 days is your reasonable notice. But if they say we need 3 weeks, then 3 weeks is your reasonable notice. So you do your homework, you run the scenarios and the what ifs, write it all down and document it. And then you're ready for when that thing comes up. And you are not caught with your pants down. You're ready and you've got the answer right here. We'd be happy to provide a sign language interpreter with at least fill in the blank number of hours or days of notice. Yes, we can do audio description. I did my homework. I know where I can borrow or rent the equipment. And I know I can call CCAC to find the name of a qualified audio describer. That's what makes access work, because nobody, not even the Kennedy Center, lives in a world where we have unlimited resources. We are always constrained by our situation, our circumstances, and our resources. But I want to make sure that no one is excluded. So I'm going to put into place the foundational services that no matter what are going to be there every day, and my audience can depend on it. Like Tina said, I'm going to advertise that. And then I'm going to say, and if you need these other things, give me a call. We'd be happy to talk to you.
And I would also recommend make it a line item in your budget from the beginning and not as an afterthought. And I know, Brittany, you know, like I talked to you a little bit, like, what is that? What are those numbers? Like, and so I think it's really important. If you know that your show is a 2-hour show, how do you budget for that? But it's better to have that money and not use it than to be scrambling for the money afterwards when someone makes a reasonable request.
Yeah, a wise person once told me that an organization's budget is its moral document. And so it's like, if you do prioritize accessibility or your diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, then you do have to start putting some money aside for that intentionally. From the Chicago Humanities Festival's perspective, where I work in my day job, in the before the pandemic, we were producing 100 unique events a year in 40 different rental venues a year. And how we started with accessibility, which back when I started in 2013, we were not accessible. So we just noticed, all right, we have an older population in our audience that are asking for things. we have some people with disabilities in our audience that are asking for things, and we don't necessarily know how to meet that need. So we surveyed what people needed most in our audience and started prioritizing that. And at that time, I got some resources from the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, figuring out, all right, how do I do this? What equipment's required? What are qualified service providers to fulfill this? And learned from there. Learned how to ensure that when people are buying tickets, that they have a way, a human being, myself, how do they request accessibility? We also just tried to embed a very free form when people are checking out on our website of, here are some prompts of accessible services that we can offer, including physical access. So where do you want to sit? You know, we can reserve a seat for you, even though the house is general admission. We will put your name on a chair in the area that you need to sit. So they have a phone number and an email and a web form as a way to request. Or if people are calling on the phone, all of our customer service staff was trained to prompt every patron, do you need an accessible accommodation? And know how to follow up if someone says, what's that? And then give some examples. And we basically have grown in how we have handled accessible accommodations to last year, where we've served over 900 individuals with 400 different requests a year. So we're able to do that by just putting aside some money. And to be transparent about those numbers, I mean, it should map differently onto the size of your organization. We have a $4 million budget, and we set aside around $11,000 the first time to be able to accommodate all the requests that could possibly come in for 100 unique events in a year. And once that started catching on, and it was very successful, we upped it to $15,000 a year. And that was mostly to pay for service providers like captioners, ASL interpreters, and audio describers. There's a lot of things that are completely free, physical access, or doing DIY captions if you have scripted theater. There's a lot of ways in which you can be scrappy about it and still provide good access. But if you need to know what things cost, we are happy to help answer that question if you email ICAN at chicagoculturalaccess.org. But roughly off the top of my head, a captioner is around $140 an hour, and an ASL interpreter is around $75 an hour. That varies depending on your location, and it varies depending on who you're working with, but that's the numbers off the top of my head for booking people. So it's really important just to plan in advance when you're allocating money that there is some money set aside for that. I have another question. Let's see. It was about masked and masked environments, though I think that there has been some answers already to it. But in a masked COVID environment, how do we approach the possibility of losing the element of facial expression in sign language interpretation? Have we considered a signer being remote or filmed, transmitted to a screen in a theater so as to retain the important component of ASL performance in a masked environment? Do you have input on how to approach this?
I think you just answered your own question, which is that you get creative. Because you have to remember, ASL is not just what's happening on your hands, it is what's happening on your face and your body. This is all part of the language. And mask is going to impact that communication environment. So you can talk with your interpreters about what their level of comfort is with different kinds of face coverings. But a remote interpreter in this day and age is not a bad idea if you do it well and you do it right.
I was going to say too, depending on your public health entity, I think that there are some places that are a little bit more open to using face shields. And so I know in some schools and different places that using a face shield for an interpreter only if the interpreter is comfortable, you know, in that situation. And in those situations, you actually should be more than 6 feet away. And so I know if face coverings like a mask, like there are masks with clear windows, but those tend to fog also. But I do know some interpreters in the schools that are using face shields because it is allowed, and they know that it gives their students access. But I personally would leave that up to the decision of the interpreter to see if they're comfortable with that. But I like the idea of remote interpreting also.
Okay, it looks like we're down to about 2 minutes. Do you have any closing advice for the participants?
I'm going to jump in and just say, it sounds a little scary when we just throw all this stuff at you, and that is certainly not the intent. I think that the thing that I want you to take away, I would like you to take away from this is, number one, it starts with small baby steps. You don't have to do it all at once. That's why your advisory group is really important, and why you ask them to help you prioritize your efforts, is because you're going to have to start somewhere. And to leverage this community. There were at its peak about 122 people on this Zoom, and that's just, maybe there were multiples in the room. Leverage the knowledge and the expertise that your community has. You guys are so lucky here in Chicago and Illinois. You have great experts, and almost all of them are happy to talk to you, and it's usually free.
And it's not just, like you talked about Global CAN earlier, Betty. It's not just, we don't have a border around Illinois that doesn't, we can also reach out to all different kinds of, resources that we have out there. I think what this is going to do is we're going to just keep building networks. We're going to keep learning from each other, with each other.
I do have one last thing, though, I forget. I think it's really important to go back to the basics, which is that accessibility is a right that we as a society have conferred on ourselves and our friends and our family. And that the arts community has, I believe, a higher obligation to endorse those rights and support those rights. And we do it by making sure that we are open and welcoming to the community and engaging in dialogue with them. So don't forget that.
All right. Thank you, everybody. There's lots of resources in the chat box, and feel free to email us or join our Facebook group if you have more questions that weren't answered. I know this was pretty performance focused, and there was one lingering question about museum space, but we're happy to talk to you offline in other channels to discuss museums. And of course, ICAN and the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium will continue offering workshops on themes that are most relevant to you. So please do take our survey to let us know what you need to know, and we will make sure that we schedule more sessions to help train you and your team to become more accessible in your different environments. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Logos appear. Workshop presented by ICAN, the Illinois Cultural Accessibility Network, as part of One State 2020 Arts Conference. ICAN is administered by Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, with funding from the Illinois Arts Council Agency through federal funds provided by the National Endowment for the Arts. Video editing, captioning, and audio description by BridgetMelton.com.